we are here ready to discuss some interesting issues connected with academic writing traditions. So the topic of our seminar is academic writing traditions, tips on how to switch from local to international publishing requirements. We are going to start with this poll. And on this slide, you can see 3 statements. And I'm going to ask you to respond yes or no to each of the statements. And I'm very happy to see that we have 100% on the first statement. It means that we are on the same page, and we have a lot to discuss today about these cross-cultural differences in academic writing. Then for the second statement, we have 75% of no and 25% of yes. I just want to say here that English academic writing tradition is reader-oriented, and we are going to talk about that a bit later, which means that the author tries to do everything possible to foresee all the questions that the reader might have, so that the reader will be comfortable with the information presented in the paper. Okay, and then for the third statement, we have 50% yes and 50% no. Well, the thing is that the English language paragraph develops just like a straight line, and everything that doesn't pertain to the topic shouldn't be there. So the correct answer would be yes, but we are going to talk about that a bit later. Now I'm going to show the outline of our workshop, of our seminar today. First, we'll touch upon different rhetorical traditions which caused differences in academic writing traditions. And we'll travel back in time a little bit, and we'll talk about different philosophical beliefs which affected these differences in rhetorical traditions. Then we'll discuss dimensions, which will help us to be aware of these differences so that we can switch from our local academic writing tradition to the English language international academic writing tradition. So there will be example, tips, and of course, practice. And I would like to let you know that all of my examples are going to be from the humanities, because I collected them through quite a long period of time while getting ready for my lectures or writing my papers. I just don't want you to be disappointed, because these examples are illustrating interdisciplinary phenomena that are typical of international academic writing tradition. So they do not relate just to one discipline, okay? And then we will wrap up by, summing up what to do to adapt to international writing requirements. Okay, so this is our outline for today. And now I'm going to show you this doodles, these diagrams. Do you know what they mean? What they signify? This is exactly how you design the structure of your text. And these are culturally determined rhetorical styles, okay? So there are 5 culturally determined rhetorical styles, and we have all these cultures on this blue line. So I'm going to ask you to match a rhetorical culture with the corresponding doodle, okay? So the first one is this straight arrow, 1, and then you choose the corresponding culture. Yes, indeed, it's English, okay? So I give you a minute, and then we will discuss the results. Have you identified any rhetorical styles besides English? Okay, number 2 is English. These are parallel construction. There's a question about what's the meaning of the solid and dashed lines. So when they're dashed, I guess they stand for some digressions. Russian would be number 4 or 5. That's true. Well, let me show you the answer key. Oriental is number 3. That's correct. So this is the answer key, and these doodles come from Robert Kaplan's paper, which was published in 1966, so a long time ago, and it's called Cultural Thought Patterns in Intercultural Education. Okay, so you were absolutely right. The first one, the first arrow, signifies English academic writing because it develops in a straight line. We have mentioned this already. There should be no digressions. The paragraph develops in a very linear way. The second doodle or the second diagram describes the Arabic academic writing, Arabic and Hebrew. And you know, these lines, they signify parallel constructions that writers of this academic tradition are fond of. And these parallel constructions cause a certain degree of repetition, which for an English native speaker would seem, you know, awkward, archaic, and standing in a way of communication. Okay, and this repetition occurs at all levels, morphological, lexical, and chunk level as well. So the third one, you know, indeed, it signifies Oriental or Asian academic writing. You were absolutely right, because it's characterized with its indirection. And the author just goes in circles and never approaches the subject directly, okay? So Asian academic writing is usually characterized with its indirectness. The fourth diagram describes the Romance style of academic writing, and Kaplan drew this arrow based on the academic writing of French and Spanish native speakers. And he said that, you know, they use this elaborate style. They use digressions as well, and they have this long, complex sentences, which are not typical of the English language academic writing. And then the final arrow, the most beautiful one, I guess, it describes the Russian academic writing. Unfortunately, Kaplan had just one essay. Moreover, it was in Russian, so they translated it into English, and then, you know, they tried to identify some features of Russian academic writing. They said that it's also elaborate with lots of digressions. But what surprised Kaplan the most was that, you know, there were just 3 sentences. And the first 2 sentences were very short. And the third sentence was extremely long. Very, you know, complex sentence with lots of digressions, with lots of subordinate clauses, which for an English native speaker would be really complicated to comprehend, okay? So as we can see, this issue of differences in academic writing traditions have a long history. And of course, later, of course, because very often the one who starts talking or raising some important issues gets later criticized for that. So Kaplan was later criticized for using his American students' academic writing as a benchmark to measure academic writing of students from other cultures. But still, this is the start of the academic community being aware of all these differences in academic writing. So in his paper, Kaplan claimed that, and he explained it very clearly, that logic is a cultural phenomenon. And the way we use arguments, actually what we consider to be arguments, is culturally specific, okay? And I want to show you one more research, well, one more book by Ulla Kona, a Finnish linguist. Again, it's a very good example of the study about how a person's first language and their culture influence writing in a second language. And once again, in the third chapter, you can see that she's discussing academic writing typical of Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, German, Finnish, Spanish, and Czech cultures. And she stresses one very important feature, that cultures, academic writing cultures, can be actually divided in two groups, inductive and deductive. And for instance, English academic writing is deductive because they place the main claim at the start of the paper and then they look for the arguments to support their claim. Whereas, for instance, Chinese academic writing is considered to be inductive. So the claim, if you can find it, it would be at the end of the paper. Besides, the thesis statement can be hidden in the information presented by the writer, so that, as we've mentioned before, the author doesn't address the subject of his study directly. So if you're interested in this contrastive rhetoric features, I would highly recommend you this book. Now we are going to go back in time a little bit and look at these two different philosophical traditions which caused these differences in academic writing. Okay, so international English language academic writing is influenced by the Aristotelian philosophical beliefs. They're also described as Socratic, and this kind of learning environment usually focuses on self-generated knowledge, which means that discussions are important, analytical study is important, persuasion is very important, and arguments or proofs are central to any process of persuasion according to these Aristotelian beliefs. And Aristotle said that people are most easily persuaded when they suppose that something has been proven. Okay, and according to this philosophical Aristotelian tradition, structure is very important, and structure of your speech or of the essay doesn't matter, but the first part of a speech should contain the speaker's final point. Okay, and then having a starting point, it will be easier to be more persuasive, so to find proof for the writer. And Confucian philosophical beliefs are completely different. Learning environment, which is affected by Confucian beliefs, focuses on the pragmatic acquisition of essential knowledge, which means that repetition, learning by heart is a part of this learning environment. It values diligent study, social harmony, reverence for teacher's authority, and avoidance of conflict. Benevolence is the core of this tradition of peace and harmony. So if the author is trying to be too direct, too persuasive, it means that the author is actually trying to violate this principle of peace and harmony. Okay, so you shouldn't be too pushy, too persuasive. Now, for this activity, we have 6 statements which describe academic writing traditions affected either the Aristotelian beliefs or Confucian beliefs. So I'm going to ask you to classify the statements under 2 categories, and you can combine a number with the appropriate letter, for instance, 1A, 2C, and then we will discuss the answers. Okay, I guess we are ready to discuss the results. You are absolutely right. And I'm going to show you this table, which is actually not just a table, it's the answer key to this assignment. So on the left, we have those statements which characterize academic writing affected by the Aristotelian beliefs. So students are taught to reveal a suggested course of action for the readers. A conclusion is a very important part of academic writing because it's your chance to make your final appeal to the audience. And we have already mentioned that it's considered to be more effective to state the conclusion first and then support it with examples. Okay, so on the right, we can see features of academic writing affected by the Confucian beliefs. So students prefer to end an argument with a new question, maybe a proverb. They think that it stimulates, the thinking process, and that the reader can thus come to the right conclusion on his or her own. Plus, it allows the writer, to preserve this peace and harmony, which is so important for this culture. Then students submit equally strong details for both sides of the argument. Okay, yes. Again, it goes, with this understanding how important it is not to be too aggressive with academic writing. And that explains why students refrain from stating their opinion directly until they've reached the concluding part of the essay, if they state their opinion at all. Okay, so we can see that the authors, the writers, actually have different expectations about the role of their readers. And so we have the first dimension here, which describes how the author, what the author expects from the reader. So it's reader-writer orientation, which determines who is responsible for making an effort to decipher information. Okay, so if it's a reader-oriented tradition, so the author does everything possible to make reader comfortable with information. Everything is explained in detail. The examples, numerous examples, will be carefully analyzed so that the reader will understand what the writer is trying to say. A writer-oriented tradition means that, a writer is free to organize the information the way he or she considers appropriate. And so some, chunks of information might be missing, and the author thinks that, it's the reader's responsibility to fill in the blanks. I do realize that there might be some disciplinary differences how we approach this orientation. So what would be the features of a reader-writer-oriented tradition of academic writing in your discipline? If it's writer-oriented tradition, we can find a lot of discipline-specific terms, and the writer won't be explaining these terms to the reader. If it's a reader-oriented tradition, then everything should be clear to the reader so that the reader can repeat or reproduce the information later. Using citations or references, yes, to support certain claims or ideas, it would be a feature of a reader-oriented tradition. A reader might expect from you so that you sum up your results in a nice and beautiful, chart or maybe pie chart, so that a reader might not want to read all of the paper, but just see the results, and then the reader will make an opinion whether he or she will read the paper or not. And a lot of supporting information to build an argument, reader-oriented. Nice abstract, it's reader-oriented. Yes, not just some impersonal, very brief information, which would be typical of the writer-oriented tradition. And this is just to sum up what we've been discussing with you. So for a reader-oriented tradition, we adopt a writer-responsible approach. So it's the writer's job to foresee all the questions that the reader might have and incorporate the answers in the text of the article. So English would be the example of a reader-oriented tradition. For a writer-oriented tradition, we adopt a reader-responsible approach, and a reader is expected to make an effort to fill in information gaps and, if necessary, to look for explanations on their own. Russian and Chinese would be examples of a writer-oriented tradition. So here I have some examples, and we are going to have a look at these examples together, and we'll try to describe them either, well, we'll try to distinguish whether they're writer or reader-oriented, okay? The first one is writer-oriented, and the second is reader-oriented. Why do we think, and I guess we all agree that the first example is writer-oriented. Why do we think so? We are going to discuss examples that come from, or that are taken from both articles in Russian and in English. And it illustrates that the same dimensions can be incorporated in any language, right? So they are not just specific to English language academic writing. We can adapt these features into Russian academic writing as well. So the first sentence, or the first example, sorry, is described as writer-oriented. Why? It's overloaded with terms. Exactly. Thank you for your contribution. And the terms are not explained at all. And besides, the author tells us that she's going to use songs in her study, right, in English, but she doesn't provide any explanation what kind of songs these are going to be, right, and how many songs she chose for her study, whether they're American songs or British songs or Canadian songs. And I think also the final statement that, the music is so important for socializing, starting with the first days of our life. I guess it needs some more confirmation, right? Because I'm not persuaded just, with the sentence. So indeed, it's writer-oriented. And the second example was described absolutely correctly as reader-oriented because it's extra work to understand it. Indeed, yes, it's kind of heavy with information. The first example, and I guess the second is the complete opposite to the first one, right? We get a detailed and clear information about how the author selected the texts for her study, how many texts she chose, where she found them, and how she analyzed them. And, the fact that she has the section on methodology in her study also shows that the author tries to be reader-oriented. We have two more examples here. We'll try to describe them, whether they're reader or writer-oriented. And assumptions in the middle part of the first text weren't supported. Complicated term. And I'm a linguist, but I have no idea what this, interbook space means. And what this is, we're talking about the fourth example, right? So we're going a little bit backwards, but indeed, we can describe the third example as reader-oriented. It's very similar to the second example, right? It's just in English. We get the same information about how the author chose a corpus for her study, how many makeup tutorials she used, which period of time they last, and how she collected this makeup tutorial. So a very detailed information about how she selected the material for her study. Well, number 4, actually, if we read it, I think we have more questions than answers, right? So it would be considered or described as writer-oriented because we have no idea how many dialogues the author chose for the study, how he selected those dialogues. And this beneficial stage development of a character, again, it's a very complicated term and we don't know what it means. So the question is, we do understand that in order to comply with international academic writing traditions, we need to focus on the reader, right? But how can the author make it easier for the reader to understand the information in a research paper in your field? Obviously, from our previous discussion, we can say that we should probably explain all the terms which are very specific to our discipline, right? What else can we do? Give the examples, maybe, yes, for sure. And maybe provide some explanations, right? What these examples try to explain. We can reread the text, trying to look at it from the reader's point of view. Yes, we can do that, of course, whether everything is clear or not. Rephrase exactly to make sure the information is presented clearly to the reader, not to use too much terms, yes. And maybe we can ask, well, our wives and husbands or our friends to read our papers to make sure they understand most of the information that we try to, but yeah, structure is very important, and we'll be talking about its importance a bit later. There's a lot of advice how we can make the information easier for the reader. And of course, there might be some journal requirements. So we should be aware of some variations, but some of the suggestions include, we should clearly state the aim of the research, and not just once. We should probably restate the aim if we structure our paper into parts, so each part should start or should touch upon the aim of the research. It's important to describe which methods we use so that the reader understands how we conduct our research. It's also important to explain how the research corpus was compiled, or how the analyzed data or maybe some case studies were selected. It's a good idea to use some charts or tables to visualize the findings, to systematize them so that the reader can easily understand what we have achieved with our research. We need to pay attention to a conclusion and sum up the findings carefully in this final part of the paper. And it's a good idea to rely on a form-oriented approach, which means that it's a good idea to structure our paper into logical parts. So these are just some of the suggestions that we can incorporate in our academic writing to make it reader-oriented. Now, if we want to be reader-oriented, it means that we would probably want to engage the reader in the information that we present with our research. So for the reader-oriented tradition, it would be typical to use all kinds of reader engagement means. But if it's a writer-oriented tradition, then the writer might feature a low use of reader engagement means. So basically, reader engagement demonstrates how actively you as a writer compete for the attention of your reader. So features of low reader engagement level include rare use of dialogicity means and a lot of impersonal language. So if we want to be, or if we want to demonstrate a high reader engagement level, then we will use all kinds of dialogicity means and will adopt a more personalized approach to the reader. Okay, I do realize that there are sometimes journal requirements, very formal requirements, and the editors think that the language should be more impersonal, so that the focus on actually what you do, not on the personality of the reader and the writer. But if possible, then we can introduce some of this engagement means to kind of keep the attention of the reader on the information that we are trying to share with our research. So for this activity, I'm going to show you several examples of the sentences. You can find them on your handout as well. And I want to ask you to, to identify whether these examples engaging or not. And if yes, why do you think these examples can be described as engaging? Okay, so here are these examples. So we have a lot of agreement. Number 4 is completely unengaging. Yes, I completely agree with you. Okay. So the first one is described as unengaging, right? It's very impersonal. The author doesn't address his or her reader, unengaging. The second is described as engaging, right? And yes, they use questions here, and we know that a rhetorical question, stimulates the thinking process, and the reader feels that the author addresses him or her directly, starts paying attention. And then the author also uses the verb давайте. It's a verb with which the author unites himself or herself with the audience, right? So it's also dialogic. The third example is engaging, right? Why do you think it's engaging? The third example? Yes, it's inclusive we. An inclusive pronoun with which the author and the audience are united is a very efficient, engaging or means of engagement. We don't talk here about pronoun we for single authored articles when it's just a part of academic tradition. Here we mean inclusive pronoun we, which includes both the writer and the reader. In this case, we can describe the example as dialogic, and that would be example number 3. Everybody agrees that number 4 is totally unengaging. The author doesn't try to, keep the reader's attention, keep the reader focused on the information. And then the 5th is also considered to be engaging, right? There's a feeling, right, that the author is talking directly to the writer. Рассмотрим implies we, exactly. So these are the verbs such as давайте, рассмотрим, which guide the reader's attention. And the reader has this feeling that, the author really cares that the reader isn't lost, in this pool of information. So here, this is you're probably aware that this is a very trendy topic nowadays, and a lot of linguists research means of engagement, how they're used in different rhetorical traditions, and they think that there is a direct link between the success of the paper, and by success I mean how many readers cite this or reference this paper later, and whether it's engaging or not. So Ken Hyland, an avid researcher of academic English, describes or among means of engagement includes inclusive pronouns, directive verbs, and we have seen some examples of directive verbs earlier, right? Because as we've mentioned, directive verbs, they guide the reader's attention, and they help the reader to switch from one aspect of the information to the other. Rhetorical questions are very efficient because they hold the reader's focus, right? And they're used very often to show that the author switches from one aspect of the topic to the other. Okay, so, and it stimulates the reader's attention. References to shared knowledge, they help the author to show that the author actually respects the reader. And these references might include such expressions as we all know very well, as you are aware, or it might include some geographic names which are well known by both the writer and the reader. Asides are usually represented by some extra information that helps the reader to understand the information. And very often this information is included in the brackets, and it might be a bit personal. And there are some linguists, some researchers of academic English who say that exclamatory sentences, although we come across exclamatory sentences not very often, but they also can serve as means of engagement. Now we are going to proceed with the next activity. And I'm going to ask you to identify means of constructing engagement in the examples. So we have answers for the first 3 examples. So if you don't mind, we can briefly discuss them now. And then I can slowly show you the next slide with all this means of engagement underlined with red lines. So indeed, in the first example, we have immersing into a situation. Yes, very nice. So in the first example, we have a rhetorical question, right? The author asks the question and then the writer answers this question, right? But we can see that the author tries to involve the reader into the discussion. Then for the second sentence, we have inclusive pronoun we, absolutely right. And also we have asides, yes, in the brackets from our extracts. And at the beginning of the sentence, we have, well, actually I have these classes here. We have directive verbs, let us, okay? So it's a very good verb if you want to show that you are on the same page with your reader. You want to, unite yourself with your reader. For the third, we have, once again, inclusive pronoun. So I'll show you the next 3 examples because, once again, they have all this engagement means underlined for your comfort. Number 4, we have a rhetorical question. Directive verbs, very nice. Verbs in general. Inclusive meaning, yes. Rhetorical, inclusive, directive. Yes, you're absolutely right. So for the 4th example, you're absolutely right. We have a rhetorical question, and then the author, once she has her audience attention, she gives the answer. Yes, it's it also includes an inclusive pronoun we. Then in the 5th example, we have a verb, a very nice verb to use, приведем, right? So it's a directive verb And with this verb, the author is united with the reader. And then for the sixth example, we have inclusive pronoun and a lot of directive verbs. And, you know, I read a couple of studies which actually are very persuasive. Okay, the question is, where is exclamation sentence in number 5? Okay, well, it's just, yeah, there is no exclamation in number 5, it's true. Okay, and in number 6, we have a lot of directive verbs. And as I've mentioned, you know, directive verbs, they actually stimulate a reader's imagination rather than using abstract nouns or all kinds of nominalizations. Directive verbs help the reader to remember the information later, because, you know, the imagination starts working. So it's a very good and efficient means of engagement. Okay. Well, let me show you the next 4 examples then. Yes, reference to shared knowledge. Number 8. So number 7, we have an example of asides. And as I've said earlier, you know, sometimes an author tries to add some personal information based probably on his or her experience while conducting the research. And so this information is placed within brackets. So here, that's what the author does. Number 8, we have references to shared information, shared knowledge. Yes, it's not the best example, but still, you know, such expressions as, of course, as you know very well, would be shared knowledge. Yes. Number 9, okay, we have directive verbs, right? Смотрим, предложим, and this verbs also unite the author with their audience, right? And then the final sentence, example number 10, we have a rhetorical question and the answer. Okay, so the author wants to draw the reader's attention to this theory, probably. So just to sum up the information which we have discussed in a few moments before. So how can we enhance our research paper with means of engagement? If possible, we can use active voice from time to time. Instead of impersonal sentences, we can use questions to mark the beginnings of a new idea. Sometimes authors use questions as the titles of their subsections, okay, to draw their readers' attention to the information. We can use imperative constructions to direct the reader's attention, and we can use those imperatives with which we unite ourselves with our reader. We can make references to shared knowledge, to shared information, to express our respect towards the reader. We can sometimes introduce asides to make the information clearer, maybe to add some information that is less formal, if possible, of course. So these are just some of the suggestions, right? And of course, there might be some variations and some disciplinary specific features that the authors might use. Now, the next dimension that we will be talking about is the structure. Okay, and we know very well that international journal requirements usually include or usually suppose that we are going to structure our research carefully into logically connected parts. Okay, and so to describe this dimension, we can use a form or content orientation which determines the importance of required structure of a research paper. So for this activity, I'm going to ask you to arrange the structural elements, well, choose out of this variety of structural elements those which are typical of your discipline, and please arrange them in a logical order. Okay, we all agree that we can start with number 8, introduction. There is no one and single template which would say, you know, this is the structure that you always have to follow. 5 and 7 are part of 8, 5 and 7, yes. Well, sometimes introduction would include literature review, or sometimes introduction can include both background and literature review. So indeed, there are quite a few varieties in terms of how we can structure our paper. And I'm just going to show you some suggestions. In the middle, and you've probably heard about this structure, it was suggested by John Swales, British linguist, in his book Genre Analysis, English in Academic and Research Settings in 1990, so quite a long time ago. And it's often called, or it's widely known as IMRD structure. It's kind of simplified, right? But it can serve as a backbone to apply to our paper, and then to enhance it with more sections and subsections, right? But Swales suggested to have such sections as introduction, methodology, research, and discussion, just 4 sections, okay? Now, on the left, I have, this is a very typical structure of a paper in the humanities, okay? When you start with the introduction, then there's literature review, methodology or methods used, findings, discussion of results, and conclusion. And on the right, there's the structure that was provided by the journal European Proceedings of Social and Behavioral Sciences. And they want their potential authors to follow this structure. So you have introduction, problem statement, research questions, purpose of the study, research methods, findings, conclusion. And no variations are well received. I tried, but you're not allowed to do that. So you have to preserve this structure in your paper. So these are just some of the suggestions. Possible arrangement of structural elements, but I'm sure there can be many more variations. So in terms of how important the structure is, we can speak about either a form-oriented tradition or a content-oriented tradition, okay? So if it's a form-oriented tradition, then the author presents information in linear structures, and the structural requirements must be followed by academic community. So there are certain expectations about how the paper is going to be structured. If it's content-oriented tradition, then authors arrange the information they think they feel, the way they think it is appropriate. There are no structural requirements that are expected by academic community. And this type of academic writing, content-oriented tradition is sometimes called writing with power, which means that there are no limitations for the author, and he or she can, structure the paper the way he or she wants. Well, content-oriented tradition is typical of the reader-oriented tradition, writer-oriented tradition. And if we want the information to be clear for the reader, then most probably we will adopt the form-oriented tradition. And I want to show you several examples of possible structural organizations of the paper. And I took these examples from the journal that is published by the Italian University of Foggia in English. So it shows very well how the authors, who are, and most of the authors are Italians, how they adapted to this international publication requirements and incorporated them in their academic writing. So here, this structure illustrates, it's quite typical, and it illustrates how the author writing a paper about medical metaphors structures her paper. So she has an introduction, then corpus and methodology section, results are subdivided into two parts, and then conclusions. And I have one more example, and this structure is a bit more complicated, if I can say so. Their aims of the paper, so some of the structural components are expected by the academic community, such as discussion and concluding remarks, but the body of the paper is also structured into sections to which the authors give some unique titles and subtitles, right? So the authors enhance the fourth section with 4 subsections, you know, to make the information as clear as possible for the reader. And this is just to show how a paper which follows a form-oriented approach usually looks like. So this paper is from English language teaching. And here we can see very well that the sections are numbered. So sometimes they're numbered, sometimes they're not numbered, but the first section is introduction, then the second is literature review, and then the rest of the sections are stipulated at the bottom of the slide. Interestingly, the author has a recommendations section after conclusion of the study. And when I was looking for examples, I've discovered that very often papers that are written within, you know, teachers training or pedagogical sciences, they have recommendations as a separate section, or recommendations might be included in the conclusion section. So I guess it's specific to this area of discipline. Okay, and here's the example of, I would say, a content-oriented approach. Now, the paper was published quite a long time ago in 1990, but still it shows that the authors decided not to follow any specific structure. They did structure their paper into sections, into logical sections, but they gave those sections some unique titles, not typical titles. And even the final part of the paper is called Reflections and Prospects. So it's quite possible that even in international English language journals, we can come across content-oriented papers. Now we're going to have this, I think, very interesting activity. We are going to identify sections from which the examples were taken, and then we will also explain our choices. So what affected our decision, okay? So I'm going to show you the answer keys, but at the same time, we will discuss your choices. So here are our first 2 examples. And you think the first one comes from which section? The author actually states the aims of the study several times. Okay, so she says the present study aims at describing, mainly from a linguistic point. Then once again, she says that It will mostly aim at exploring possible similarities. So it will mostly aim at doing something in the future, right? So it comes from the introduction, and the author has several subsections, aims of the study, and this is where this abstract or fragment comes from, and then some background information, literature review. So her repeated reference to the aims of the study should be the clue, you know. What about the second example? Does the authors use past tense, right? And they actually tell us what they've already achieved with their research. So they emphasize, they identified, they examine symbols. So it comes from the conclusion section. This example, it's, as I've said, it's a bit tricky. Do you have any suggestions where it comes from? For me, this example seemed to be a bit unusual because at the end of her paper, the author uses a chart, a beautiful, colorful chart, to show her results, okay? And so she subdivides her conclusion into several parts, okay? So this part, reviewing course syllabus, material selection, and teaching methodology. And so she starts with this diagram, and then she discusses so what she's trying to show with this diagram in her conclusion. So it comes from the concluding part of the paper, which includes both some review and recommendations. The paper was on teachers training. Okay, so I've noticed a lot of variations in this disciplinary field. In linguistics, in communication sciences, I don't think it would happen. All right, so this is the next example, and we've already had something similar, right, a bit earlier from the same paper. The author discusses the corpus, how it was compiled. The author discusses also the criteria which were used for choosing the material for the study, okay? So which section do you think it is from? Well, it comes from corpus and methodology. Okay, the author decided to unite these two sections together, and it is the second section of the paper. It follows the introduction. Now, this example is kind of long, okay, but I think the fact that the author says that this study has provided a codification, okay, so in a way, the author is trying to sum up what she has achieved with the study, okay? So this fragment would be from section, which section do you think? It comes from the concluding remarks, and the author has quite a long conclusion. So she restates her aim, restates the aim of her paper, and then sums up what she has tried to achieve with this study, okay? So this is the final fragment from her concluding remarks. Okay, so she says that the study has provided, and then she explains what she has tried to provide with her paper. This one, just a hint, the tone is quite neutral, right? And the author explains what museum audio description is, how it has emerged, and how different authors studied it from different angles, right? That's what the author is doing here. So most probably it comes from which section? The introduction. This is the beginning of the paper for sure. We have a few more examples here. So once again, the authors speak about how they collected the articles which were analyzed in their study, right? How they divided them into subsections, and so how many articles they chose, how those articles were written by French researchers in English. So they basically describe what they use to base their study on. So it comes from the section, it comes from the methodology section, right? So they unite in this section the information about how they compiled the corpus for their study and how they analyzed it. Okay, so corpus and methods are explained within this section. Okay, and I guess we have one more example. This is the 8th fragment. Here, where you see all these dots, here we are supposed to see examples which the authors use to illustrate their point of view. So they just, discussing what we might deduct from these examples. They discuss some errors that we might come across in the academic writing. Okay. So it comes from the section, its results. Yeah, I wish we could see the examples they used to illustrate their ideas, but for spatial constraints, it wasn't possible, right? But they subdivided their results section into several parts. So this fragment comes from the results section. So paying attention to certain expressions and trying to understand what the author is trying to achieve with this particular section, we've arrived at this element, which is described as rhetorical moves. Okay, so basically these rhetorical moves or this rhetorical steps that we undertake, they provide kind of basis or footholds that our readers can use to understand what the author is trying to say and why the author is saying it, right? And for academic writing, rhetorical moves are very important, but I guess for any kind of professional discourses, it would play a great role. We're going to discuss briefly these rhetorical moves a bit later, but for now, I'm just curious. Which sections of research paper do you think are the easiest to write and which are the hardest? Well, I personally think that writing the methodology section and probably the discussion section would be the easiest because we deal with data. We know our research and it's easy, right, to share information about our research. Discussion is the hardest, okay. Results are the easiest, abstract the hardest, yes, because we have to put so much information in the abstract, right? And we also want the reader to be interested in our research after reading the abstract, okay? And we have a word limit that we have to follow. So yes, I personally think that introduction is the most complicated part because usually there's so much information that I would like to use, and I have to choose, what kind of information should be in the paper and which information shouldn't be there, okay? So first I put everything that I find interesting, and then I start deleting some parts of the introduction. Interestingly, nobody mentions the concluding section. But the experience shows that for young scholars, especially, writing a conclusion is quite complicated because in some rhetorical traditions, for instance, in Russian academic writing tradition, a conclusion hasn't been that important. And it could just include several sentences, which sometimes don't even correlate with the topic of the paper, and it still happens. So I wanted just to spend some time on rhetorical moves, talking about rhetorical moves that are typical for a concluding part. Okay, and then we will compare two conclusions in English and in Russian. Okay. There are a lot of resources that provide you with a lot of advice on how to write a strong conclusion, okay? Lots of university websites actually have websites about how to write a conclusion. So most of them recommend to use a topic sentence with which you sum up what you are trying to do in your paper, and this information should be correlated with the introductory paragraph, so we can use our introduction as a guide for writing a conclusion. Then we summarize the main ideas. We are allowed to appeal to readers' emotions to enhance our stance by using some adverbs or adjectives that will make the reader, understand what is our main argument. And then we include a closing sentence. And this closing sentence might speak about limitations, how we want to improve our research in the future, or how we want to place our paper within a wider disciplinary context. Okay, so basically we restate the aim, we summarize the results, and finish with limitations. I was informed that a conclusion should include at least 3 paragraphs. Okay, so a 1-paragraph conclusion that is typical for a Russian academic writing tradition is not very typical for English language academic writing requirements. For our next activity, I'm going to use a conclusion, and it consists of just 2 paragraphs. So it's not a very typical one. And we will try to identify rhetorical moves that the author applies in this concluding section. Okay, so to describe the rhetorical moves, we can use those which were mentioned on the previous slides. Okay, read this, the first paragraph of this conclusion, and then we will try to think of possible rhetorical moves. Well, then I will just show the answer keys. Okay, so that's what the author tries to do in her conclusion, restates the aim, summarizes the main ideas, and then in the second paragraph summarizes the results and finishes with a concluding sentence. So here's, you can read a conclusion in Russian just to compare how different these 2 conclusions are. Okay, and so here's the summary. To switch to international English language requirements, academic writing requirements, we need to think of we need to logically structure our paper, but we need to remember about journal requirements. We need to remember that we need to state the purpose of the paper repeatedly so that the author or the reader is aware about what we are trying to do. It's a good idea to describe carefully the methodology so that the reader understands how the author reached the conclusions. It's a good idea also to explain how the corpus was compiled or how the data for the analysis were selected. Logical connections should be introduced. It's always a good idea to use examples, but they should be accompanied with explanations. And we should try to engage our reader into the information that we present in our paper. And we should pay attention to conclusions because it's a very important part of our paper. So basically, the tips how to switch from local to international academic writing requirements would be the following. We need to remember that we will adopt a form-oriented approach. So we will need to structure our paper into logical parts. And we will need to think about our readers' interests. So we will need to switch from reader responsible to writer responsible approach. We should show our readers that we care about them. So we try to make sure that information is engaging and interesting and clear for the reader. And we should always check up with the journal requirements, maybe to look through the papers that have already been published in this journal, to be aware of what kind of requirements this particular journal has. Thank you for your attention and thank you for participation.